Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. If you're still here after all that, you already know the kind of stories we tell. The kind that crawl under your skin, that echo in the quiet when the episode ends. If you want to carry a piece of that darkness with you, wear what haunts you. Our exclusive line of merch is made for listeners who feel more at home in the uncanny, the unspoken, the things that don't make sense in the daylight. Shirts, hoodies, and other gear, designed with that same atmosphere of dread, mystery, and whispered wrongness. Candles support the channel, feed the stories. You can grab yours at https:// the shadows printify me, and as always, don't look behind you. What my cult worshipped in the woods wasn't human. Chapter 1. The road back. I had promised myself I would never come back here. For years, I spoke of this place like it was nothing more than an ugly chapter in a strange, half-forgotten book. The woods, the compound, the songs we hummed without words. To anyone who asked, I reduced it all to vague language. My family was in a group, sort of religious, out in the country. It wasn't really that bad. It was easier that way, easier than admitting what we were, what we feared, and what the old rules whispered to us when the lanterns burned low. But when the first rumor reached me that 2 hikers had gone missing, swallowed by the green miles of pine that hemmed this place in, I felt it like a pulse against my ribs. When the second rumor followed, about an abandoned property where no birds sang and where the night seemed heavier than it should be, I knew where they meant. I knew they were talking about here. About us. The road that leads to the compound had decayed into little more than a scar through the woods, a slope of gravel and moss that fought me at every turn. My headlights struggled to pierce the trees. The farther I went, the quieter everything became. Even the summer insects seemed to hush themselves, as if afraid of speaking too loudly in this corridor of shadows. My chest tightened the way it had when I was a child, clutching my sister's hand in the dark, while the elders drew lines of ash across the thresholds and muttered their warnings. Don't wander past the edge. Don't speak its name. Don't make it turn its face toward us. I told myself that I didn't believe in any of it, that the rules were just a way to keep children obedient, to weld us in place through fear. And yet, I drove slower the deeper I went. I rolled up my windows even though the air was stifling. I kept my eyes forward, afraid of what I might see flicker in the corner of my vision. The gate appeared before I was ready for it. It was smaller than I remembered, 2 blackened wooden posts with a beam across the top, carved symbols still faintly visible in the rot. They weren't letters, they weren't pictures. They were marks, twists of line and angle that made no sense but were burned into my memory. Marks meant to deflect, meant to make us less appetizing. Beyond the gate, the path forked. To the left was the long house where we slept. To the right, the meeting hall, the one place that still haunted me in dreams, where we sat in circles and repeated gestures we didn't understand, careful never to make them too perfect. Perfection was attention. Attention was danger. My car idled at the fork as my pulse thundered. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to pretend I never found this place again. But then I saw it. A shoe. Small, half buried in the dirt just before the hall. Its laces were torn. Its fabric was wet with dew. But it was recent. Far too recent to belong to anyone who had once lived here. Someone else had wandered in. And the silence of the woods pressed in harder, as though it were listening for me to make the wrong sound. Chapter 2. The compound. The road ended in dust. My car's headlights cut through the late afternoon haze, the trees pressing in close, branches weaving a canopy that devoured the sky. I had forgotten how remote this place was, how the world seemed to peel away mile by mile until there was nothing left but silence and the long dirt road. When I stepped out, I expected the air to smell like memory, wood smoke, wild sage, damp earth. Instead, it smelled stale, like wet stone left too long in the dark. The cult had called this place a sanctuary, though as a child I had never once felt safe here. They had built the compound on a clearing carved out of the woods, a cluster of buildings with paint long faded, their windows black and swollen with rot. The main lodge sagged, as though the earth had pulled it down by the bones. Barns leaned crookedly, their roof beams split. The old meeting hall stood like a carcass, ribs of timber jutting out from collapsed walls. Time had eaten it all, but the layout was burned into me. I knew where everything had stood, where each ritual was performed, where I used to stand pressed against my mother's side as she whispered the rules. The rules had been more important than prayers. Rules were how you avoided notice. I stepped through weeds that clawed up past my knees. My boots crunched glass, fragments of lanterns, jars, bottles shattered and left where they'd fallen. Flies rose in a lazy cloud, disturbed by my intrusion. The compound hadn't been touched in decades, and yet some things hadn't changed. The symbols were still there. At first glance, they looked like graffiti, scratches in wood and stone, painted spirals dulled by weather. But once you knew them, once you had been taught their meanings, you couldn't unsee them. The circles nested inside one another weren't decoration. They were blindfolds. The jagged lines cutting across thresholds weren't random. They were barricades, marks meant to confuse what passed between shadows. We never prayed in this place. We drew lines. We marked the floors. We made noise at night to keep silence from listening too hard. That was worship here, not devotion, but deflection, a choreography of evasion. As I traced the edge of one carved spiral with my fingers, I realized something I hadn't as a child. The symbols were alive. Not literally moving, not yet. But the grooves were deep, too precise for how primitive our tools had been. The wood hadn't weathered the way it should have. It was as though the carvings had resisted time, clinging to their sharpness as everything else rotted away. The hair on the back of my neck rose. The old meeting hall called to me. It had always been the center, though we never stayed inside it for long. Children were forbidden from lingering near its doors. It was where the rules had been written, where leaders held their circles, where they whispered about it. We were told that to stand inside too long was to risk its gaze drifting closer. I found the hall's doors splintered open, one hanging by a rusted hinge. Inside, the light bent strangely. Dust hung in the air like strands of webbing, catching sunbeams that had no clear source. The floorboards creaked under my weight. And there, on the far wall, was the mural. As a child, I had never dared to look at it directly. They told us it wasn't meant to be understood, only obeyed. But now I stood before it, and the image crawled under my skin. It was not a god, not a creature in any sense I could name. It was a suggestion of form, spirals that bent into limbs but dissolved into nothing, a face that seemed to fold inward, infinite eyes that weren't placed anywhere a head should be. It wasn't drawn so much as implied, as though the artist hadn't created it but revealed it. Looking at it made me dizzy, my stomach twisted. My eyes watered though I hadn't blinked. It struck me then, this wasn't a place of worship. It was a bunker. These rituals, these marks, this mural, they weren't tributes. They were instructions. Every scratch, every chant, every step my mother had made me memorize had been a survival drill. And now the drills were over. No one was left to perform them. The silence of the compound deepened until I could hear my pulse in my ears. The dust shifted in the air like it was breathing. And for the first time since I had stepped back onto this cursed ground, I had the awful certainty that I wasn't alone. Chapter 3. The first rule we never broke. I must have been 6 the first time I realized the grown-ups were afraid. Not of us, not of discipline, not even of the punishments they sometimes carried out in silence. They were afraid of something else, something that lived just outside our little circle of cabins. We weren't allowed to call it a god. I remember Sister Miriam snapping at me once when I asked why we didn't pray before eating, like I'd heard in town when they took me along to barter for flour. Her hand trembled as she shushed me, her knuckles white against the wood of the table. Not a god, child, not a god. Don't draw its eye. That was the first lesson. Never call it a god. The second came during games. At night, when the kerosene lamps were dimmed and the forest pressed close against our windows, the older children would whisper rules to the younger ones. Rules that were dressed up as dares and games of hide-and-seek. Don't whistle after sundown. Never step across a shadow without bowing your head. If you hear your name in the dark, don't answer, even if it's your mother's voice. We followed these rules the way kids anywhere might follow superstition. At 6, I didn't think much of it. But I remember the way the adults tightened their jaws when we repeated them, how their eyes darted toward the tree line as if the trees themselves might be listening. That summer, one of the boys in our group, Jonah, didn't listen. He was older, maybe 9, and already braver than the rest of us. He didn't like rules. One evening, while we played behind the main hall, the dusk hanging thick and purple, he cupped his hands around his mouth and whistled, a sharp, shrill tune that cut through the night. The sound didn't echo. That was what chilled me first. Instead of carrying through the trees, the whistle seemed to die in the air between us, like the world swallowed it before it had a chance to live. We all froze. Even Jonah tried to laugh, but the sound felt brittle, like a glass about to shatter. The adults came running. Brother Thomas grabbed Jonah by the shoulders, shaking him so hard I thought his head might snap. Not with anger, but with terror. He kept muttering, not tonight, you fool child." We were herded inside, the lamps doused until the hall was nearly black. I remember the elders forming a circle, hands clasped, lips moving but never in prayer. Their voices weren't asking for blessing. They were whispering a pattern, a sequence, words that had no meaning to me, syllables that seemed to choke the air itself. I didn't see what Jonah saw when he pressed his face against the window. I only remember the way his smile drained, the way his body went so still he seemed carved from wax. Later, when I asked him what he'd seen, he said nothing. He just stared past me, like I was blocking a view of something enormous standing behind my shoulder. Jonah didn't last long after that. He wasn't taken, not in the way stories usually go. He just withered. By autumn, he wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat unless forced. His eyes stayed glassy and hollow, like he was always listening for that silence where his whistle had gone. When the cold came, he was gone too. They told us it was sickness, but I remember the way no one looked at the woods for days afterward. That was the third rule, though no one ever said it out loud. Don't make it look at you. I didn't understand then, but I do now. Looking back, I think the games were never games, and the rules were never meant for us. They were warnings, ways to keep us alive. And Jonah had broken the first one that mattered. Chapter 4, the compound answers the door gave way with the groan of rotting wood, and the smell that drifted out was not one of death or mold as I'd expected, but of something clean. Too clean, as though the air inside had been sealed away for decades, untouched by rain or animal or time. It carried that faint mineral bite of old stone, of water that had never seen the sun. The compound's interior was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply grown. The narrow corridors, once labyrinthine in childhood memory, pressed close now like the insides of a ribcage. My flashlight beam trembled over peeling paint, over the remnants of murals scrawled by hands long dead. Their lines were simple, triangles within circles, ladders without rungs, arcs bent away from each other like mouths refusing to meet. I recognized them. Rules disguised as symbols. Do not cross, do not climb, do not touch. But in childhood, they had been little more than shapes on a wall, explained away as the language of safety. Now, seeing them again with adult eyes, I noticed something I never had before. The way they seemed etched into the very surface, not painted but burned, their grooves blackened and rough beneath my fingers. I pulled my hand back. The grooves were warm. The silence inside was oppressive. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something listening. Every step I took sent echoes skittering down the hallway, and those echoes did not return the way they should. They seemed delayed, stretched, as though repeating from farther away than the walls allowed. More than once, I thought I heard a second cadence beneath my own, a half step late, like someone walking a beat behind me. I forced myself deeper. My flashlight found the remains of the gathering hall, the space where we had sat cross-legged as children, chanting in voices we never understood. The benches were gone, collapsed into piles of termite dust, but the wall at the far end still bore the great circle. It was no painting. It had been cut deep into the plaster and stone, wide enough to swallow the height of 3 men. I remembered the rules. Never face it alone. Never face it in silence. I had laughed at those words in my adolescence, mocked them in my mind when I first escaped the cult. But standing before that hollow ring carved into the wall, with nothing between me and it but my own breathing, the laughter felt brittle. My mouth was dry. I tried to swallow, but the sound of it echoed too loudly. That was when I noticed the dust. The air in the hall was still, and yet fine motes shifted along the curve of the circle, as though stirred by something imperceptible. I turned off my flashlight. Darkness swallowed everything. Yet the ring remained visible, not glowing, not shining, but there, as though my eyes had been trained since childhood never to lose sight of it. And I realized I was humming. Low, tuneless, an old reflex. A chant we used to keep it from noticing us too directly. The sound shook in my throat, unbidden. I backed away until my shoulder struck the frame of the doorway, breath shallow, sweat chilling my back, despite the stagnant air. The moment I turned the flashlight on again, the dust was still. The grooves of the circle lay inert, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt aware. Chapter 5. The first answer, the silence in the compound, had always seemed like a choice. As a child, the narrator remembered the heavy quiet of nights when every adult forbade laughter, when the fires were smothered before midnight, and even the smallest cough was hushed beneath a parent's hand. That silence had seemed deliberate but survivable, the way one might wait out a storm, still and patient. Now, as an adult, standing in the remains of the meeting hall, the silence did not feel like restraint. It felt like something listening. The long table remained in the center of the room, its wood warped and split where years of rain had seeped through the broken roof. The benches leaned sideways, half-rotted. On the back wall, the familiar sigil was still visible, the one their mother had once traced into the air before sleep, a looping shape that spiraled inward, like a knot with no beginning. It hadn't been drawn in paint. It had been cut into the wood, shallowly at first, and then, over time, deepened by dozens of overlapping carvings, until the grooves formed channels that seemed to absorb light. The narrator's stomach clenched when they realized the channels were damp, not from rain, not from rot, but from something that beaded like condensation, even though the wood around it was dry. They backed away. Their shoes scuffed across the floor, and the sound bounced strangely, not an echo, but a delay, as though the wood absorbed the noise and released it in fragments seconds later. A memory surfaced unbidden, a rule whispered in childhood. Don't scrape your chair in the hall. Don't drag wood on wood, because it wasn't just noise. It was signal. They swallowed hard and turned to leave the meeting hall, but the doorway that had been wide open a moment before now felt narrower. Not physically blocked, not changed, just receded. As if distance itself had thickened between them and the exit. The air cooled, though the night outside was still warm. Their breath misted faintly, a trembling little cloud. And then, from the far end of the hall, a sound. A chair shifting, slow, deliberate, as though someone unseen had risen, dragging the bench just enough to remind them of the rule they had just broken. The narrator's pulse thundered in their throat. Their body remembered being 10 years old, shrinking beneath the weight of warnings they never understood. Never scrape, never hum, never call its name. They forced their legs forward, passing the sigil without looking at it, passing the damp grooves that seemed to pulse as if with a heartbeat. At the threshold, the floorboards dipped under their weight, and for a split second the whole structure groaned. Not the groan of wood, the groan of something old and awake. Outside, in the night air, they staggered, hands braced against their knees, fighting the tremor that ran through them. But the compound was no longer still. From behind them, faintly, the sound of benches shifting continued. Not one, not two, dozens. As though the congregation they remembered from childhood had risen again, careful not to pray. Chapter 6. The rule of silence. The path through the compound narrowed as I moved deeper. The cabins grew closer together, their roofs slumping in on themselves like weary shoulders. Windows stared, clouded with mildew. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin, sharp enough to sting. It reminded me of the days we weren't allowed to speak. That was one of the rules, too. Silence for the passing. The thought came unbidden, as if whispered into my ear. My chest tightened. I told myself I was only remembering. Still, I slowed my steps because the forest itself seemed to be listening. At the edge of the clearing stood what used to be the gathering hall, a place of long benches and endless chanting. Its doors were swollen with damp. The boards creaked when I pressed them open, groaning like something alive. Inside, the air was thick with rot and dust, but there were fresher scents beneath it, something like burned wax, faint as breath. I told myself I was imagining it. The walls still bore the old carvings, the runes the elders insisted were only marks of safety. As a child, I had traced them with my fingertip until the shapes blurred, and the rules whispered themselves into my head like lullabies. Looking at them now, the grooves seemed deeper than I remembered, as if the wood had been fed upon. I walked to the far end of the hall. The floor dipped where the altar had once stood. The stone slab was still there, though the cloth was long gone. It wasn't the slab that drew me. It was the space behind it. A dark mouth yawned there, a crawl space of some kind. I crouched, aiming my flashlight into the gap. The beam reached only a few feet before the dark swallowed it. Something shifted within, not sound, not movement. Maury-like, a hesitation in the air. I turned off the light. My pulse hammered. I didn't know why I did it, but I held my breath. The silence pressed in on me, total and absolute. Then very faintly I heard it. Breath, not mine. Low, patient, steady. I snapped the flashlight back on. The beam caught only rough wood, splinters, damp stone, nothing else. I exhaled slowly, shaking. My chest hurt from the way I had clenched it tight. Silence for the passing. The phrase whispered again in my head, carrying that old sting of childhood fear. We were told never to breathe too loud in those moments, that if the silence was broken, it would know. I backed away from the altar, the carvings seeming to waver at the edges of my sight. I wanted to leave, but I forced myself to linger, to stand in that heavy room just long enough to confirm I hadn't imagined it. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized something I didn't want to admit. It wasn't memory. The rules weren't echoes of childhood at all. They were still in effect. Chapter 7. I was 7 the first time I noticed how the grown-ups' smiles never reached their eyes. At that age, I thought I was good at reading people. I knew when my mother's exhaustion had tipped into anger before a word was spoken. I knew when my father was forcing his patience to hold. Children live in silences, in tiny facial twitches, in the weight of a room shifting without anyone speaking. In the compound, the grown-up silences were different. They smiled at us too much. All teeth, all dimples, their voices bent upward at the ends of sentences, as though they were always giving permission. Yes, of course, sweetheart. Yes, you're so good, sweetheart. But behind the words, there was this, stillness, like they were only waiting for something else to happen. It was on the long walks across the dry fields that I began to understand. Every child was paired with an older guide. One of the men or women who was not your blood, but expected to stand in as if they were. They were the ones who taught us the rules, who repeated the mantras like songs. Never stand where your shadow crosses another's. Never look directly at the well after sundown. Never let your mouth hang open when you breathe. I didn't know what they meant. None of us did, but we obeyed. That day, we walked to the outbuilding at the far edge of the property, the one that leaned against the pines like it was too tired to stand upright. The guide assigned to me was Sister Aline, a thin, long-fingered woman whose hair was braided so tight it looked like it hurt. She always smelled faintly of vinegar and soil, like something rotting just beneath the surface. When we got to the outbuilding, she told us to wait outside. She and the other guides went in, the door closing softly behind them. I remember standing there with the other children, shifting from foot to foot, trying not to look at the gaps in the wood where slivers of dark pressed through. Then the sound began. At first it was only murmuring, maybe prayer, maybe voices overlapping in some strange rhythm. But then it grew lower, a single note rising out of them all, droning like a horn. The walls seemed to shiver. The boards beneath my shoes hummed. The older kids didn't move. They kept their hands clasped, their eyes lowered. I tried to copy them, but curiosity made me glance sideways, just for a heartbeat, into one of the gaps in the boards. For an instant, I thought I saw faces in there. Not the guides, not human, not really. Too many eyes, all blinking at once. A mouth or mouths, moving in rhythm with the droning, as though the sound wasn't being made by voices, but by the room itself. I must have gasped, because one of the older kids pressed their elbow hard into my ribs, hissing without words. The pain shocked me back into stillness. When the door finally opened again, the guides came out looking as they always did. Calm, clean, faces smoothed into that same smile. But their eyes had gone strange, wet and glinting, like they'd been somewhere else entirely. Sister Aline placed her hand on my head as if in blessing. Her palm was ice cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my cot, listening to the breath of the other children, and every time someone exhaled too loudly, I wanted to reach across the dark and press their mouth closed, because I knew then, without being told, why they had given us those rules. Chapter 8. The air inside the compound had thickened, not just with the scent of dust or rot, but with something harder to name, an invisible density pressing against my skin. The deeper I wandered into the hall, the more the place seemed to hum, as though the building itself was not entirely inert. I stopped beside a row of rusted cots, their skeletal frames lined in military precision, and tilted my head. At first, I thought I had imagined it, a faint vibration just below the level of sound, the kind of low resonance you feel in the bones of your skull before you properly hear it. But then it began to separate from silence, a tone so deep and steady it could have been mistaken for the groan of earth shifting beneath the foundation. My first thought was machinery, some old generator hidden beneath the concrete. Yet it wasn't mechanical. It lacked the stutter, the metallic chatter. Instead, it was unwavering, almost patient. It reminded me of a long-held breath. I froze, notebook halfway raised in my hand. My pulse matched the rhythm of that sound. Or maybe the sound was bending itself around the beat of my pulse. It felt old, as if the walls had carried it for years without interruption, waiting for someone to notice again. I wrote a single line on the paper, the rule of silence. The walls remember sound. As soon as the words left my pen, the tone shifted. Barely, a fluctuation, as if the sound itself had tilted its head to look back at me. I felt the old childhood memory swell up like a bruise under the skin. The night, the droning began outside my window. The way it had followed me, saturating my sleep, until it became impossible to tell whether it came from outside or inside my own chest. Now, in the ruin of the compound, the same question bloomed again. Was the sound in the building, or was the building only shaping what had already begun to rise in me? I set the notebook down, afraid the sound might read over my shoulder, and I listened. The drone filled the silence between my breaths until it seemed to be my breathing, until it seemed to be shaping my thoughts into a single vibrating chord. It wasn't loud, not yet, but I knew where this was heading. This was the beginning of the rule returning. Chapter 9. I was 7 the first time the droning seeped into my dreams. It came not from the sky or the forest or the wind through the chapel's loose boards, but from below, a hollow, mechanical moan that rose like heat from the floorboards and seemed to pool beneath my bed. It didn't wake me so much as seep into me, winding around my bones until I stirred in a sweat, pulse hammering as if I'd already been running. The dormitory was quiet, too quiet. No shifting cots, no coughs, no murmured prayers. I remember holding my breath, listening, thinking the others had all stopped breathing at once. Then, faintly, I caught it again. The low, unsteady hum, as though someone was plucking a cello string in the earth beneath us. I pulled the blanket up to my face and squeezed my eyes shut. That should have been the end of it, if not for the rules. The rules were simple, always simple. Don't open the curtains after dark. Don't look directly into the chapel windows after the bell has rung. And never, ever go beneath the floor. I hadn't even known there was a beneath until then. The older children had whispered about trapdoors, crawl spaces, hollows, where the grown-ups went sometimes with lamps and strange bundles. They said the adults wore masks down there, masks like animal faces. They said that was where the voices lived. That night, the droning seemed to lean upward, calling me by weight rather than sound. It pressed on my chest until I swung my legs from the cot, trembling, and padded across the cold floorboards. In the far corner of the dormitory, tucked behind a wooden dresser with missing knobs, there was a square seam in the planks. I'd noticed it weeks before, but never dared to look twice. That night, I crouched and pressed my palm against it. It was warmer than the rest of the floor. I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen, with that heat breathing faintly against my hand. At some point, my ear brushed the wood and I heard, clearer now, the groaning, the endless drawn-out drone. It was joined, I realized, by another sound, a slow, irregular dragging, like something heavy shifting against stone. I jerked back so hard my head cracked the dresser, sending a dull knock through the room. One of the older boys stirred in his cot, sat up, his face pale, round, half-lit by the weak moon spilling through the dormitory windows. "You heard it too," he whispered. I wanted to deny it, to pretend I'd only been walking in my sleep. But his eyes were already fixed on me, and they were wide and wet and afraid. "They don't want us near it," he went on. His voice trembled, but it listens. It knows when we do. His gaze slid past me then, toward the dark seam in the floor. That was when I realized the droning had stopped. Not faded, stopped, like something cutting off mid-breath. The silence was worse. I crawled back to my cot and buried my face in the blanket. My skull still thrummed with the sound, though it no longer filled the air. The boy never spoke of it again, and I never asked. But the warmth of the floor lingered in my memory, as if something had been waiting just inches beneath us. Chapter 10. The sound had grown teeth. It no longer came as a faint hum threaded through the ductwork, nor as a vibration that could be dismissed as the tremor of shifting old beams. By the time I reached the central chamber, the low, circular room with its stone flooring cracked by age, the droning pressed at the air in waves. Each cycle rattled against my ribs, a resonance deeper than sound, something that seemed to settle in the marrow. I turned my flashlight along the curve of the wall, and the beam caught on the black residue smeared across the surface. It had looked at first like soot. Now, under the press of that relentless hum, I saw the patterns, handprints, layered, hundreds of them, overlapping until they built a textured relief across the stone. Children's hands mostly, small palms with short fingers, each one pressed into the wall and held long enough to leave oil, sweat, whatever lingered on the skin. A collective mark of belonging, or of entrapment. The drone swelled louder now, and for an instant it almost carried words. Not fully formed, only the cadence, the rhythm of speech. My stomach lurched, recognizing not the sense of language but the attempt. The structure itself was trying to speak, and failing, caught between tone and word. I stumbled closer to the wall before realizing I had moved. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rust wet with rain, though I knew the place had been sealed for decades. My breath came shallow. Every instinct screamed to leave, to claw back to the stairwell and out into the night. But the drone seemed to have threaded into my bones now, and each step backward felt like pushing against a tide that would only drag me back. And then the echo came. It was subtle at first. My own breathing, halting, uneven, mirrored back from somewhere in the chamber. But the rhythm faltered. The return did not match. A half-beat delayed, then wrong, inhaling when I exhaled, hitching when I steadied. I froze, my chest burning as I tried to hold my breath still. The echo went on. It drew air into phantom lungs I could not see, an audible drag, as if the walls themselves had found a throat. The drone beneath it wavered, caught for a moment in the imitation of that breath, and I knew without understanding how. The compound was remembering me. It was not haunted in the sense of some foreign presence. It was imprinted, alive with repetition, with the rules we had been made to keep as children. The wall shifted under my flashlight beam. Not physically, at least not in any way that would hold up under touch, but my eyes caught motion in the overlapping prints. The layered hands seemed to flex, a ripple of faint, wet gleam rolling across them, as though the last child had only just lifted their palm away. The drone peaked, and with it, something finally broke the pattern of my restraint. A shape, no more than a distortion in the corner of the chamber, peeled away from shadow. Not a person, not fully. The proportions leaned wrong, elongated in places, shrunk in others, as though it were a collage of half-forgotten details. Its head tilted, the drone shifted in pitch, and in the same voice the children had once been made to follow, it whispered the first of the rules. Chapter 11. The voice in the walls, the droning, did not fade this time. It swelled, deepening into something that wasn't just sound but vibration, thick enough to press into the marrow of my bones. Every step forward in that corridor felt like stepping into the belly of a throat, swallowed, compressed, forced to move with the rhythm of something larger than myself. The walls, those concrete slabs pitted with age, seemed to bow inward almost imperceptibly, bending toward me as though to listen, or perhaps to breathe me in. I pressed my palms to my ears, but the sound wasn't in the air anymore. It was in me, behind my sternum, resonating in my teeth, an endless hum straining upward toward words. And then it found them. A voice cut through the droning, still deep but sharpened now into syllables. My name, spoken once, slowly, drawn out as though tasting it, dragging the syllables through grit and stone. My throat closed up instantly. No one alive in this compound knew my name. No one alive should know my name here. I spun, flashlight beam trembling across doorways, shadows jolting from one corner to the next. Empty, dust motes, the same sagging pipes. Yet the voice kept crawling up through the noise, louder, nearer, like it had rooted itself under the skin of the walls and was dragging closer to the surface. I backed down the hall, my boots crunching on glass. Each step backward seemed to pull an answering groan from the ceiling. The hum deepened again, not letting me go. It gathered behind me, ahead of me, circling. And then it did the most dangerous thing it could. It shifted into tone, mocking my own voice. A perfect copy, strained slightly by distortion, but unmistakably mine, calling out into the black. Don't look back, the exact words from the rules. The same tone I used when whispering them to myself as a child to keep from breaking. And hearing them here, spoken in my own voice but not by me, snapped something inside. The hallway seemed to elongate, stretched by the resonance, until it was no longer the same ruin I had entered. The doors were taller. The angles were sharper. I recognized this place, but not from memory, from nightmares, from the versions of the compound that followed me into sleep as a child, where walls opened onto rooms that didn't exist and staircases sank into places no light would touch. I stumbled back, choking down air that smelled of dust and rust and something wet. The hum rose again, and with it came the sound of breathing, not mine, not human, slow and cavernous, dragging through a throat too long. And in the center of the corridor, the dust shifted, lifting and swaying as if displaced by the outline of something standing there, something watching. I didn't dare blink. Chapter 12. The encounter the drone had grown into a constant thing, not just sound anymore, but pressure, like the air itself was vibrating at a pitch designed to rattle bone. Every doorway I passed through seemed to hum against my ribs. Every shadow thickened, as if layered with something behind it, waiting, shifting. The compound's architecture had folded into sameness. Endless corridors of cinder block and corrugated ceiling tiles, fluorescent lights that buzzed and sputtered. It was impossible to tell how long I'd been walking, whether I was retracing old steps or being pulled deeper into some center. The hum, low, unbroken, steady, erased all sense of direction. Then it stopped. Not gradually, not fading. It cut away, leaving a silence so abrupt it felt like the building itself had exhaled. I froze in the corridor, my flashlight beam trembling against the far wall. And that was when the rules, the ones from childhood, came back as if spoken aloud. Never speak your own name. Never listen to them when they call. Never, ever answer back. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. At first, I thought it was just the hum resuming at a lower pitch. But no, this was different. A voice. Not words exactly, but shapes of words curling in my ears, threading through the air like smoke. It was low, aching, and carried that unbearable cadence of familiarity. Something I'd known once, long ago, but had been forced to forget. I didn't move. My throat tightened against the urge to say anything. The voice pressed closer, rising from the walls, spilling from vents, trickling from the cracked tile above me. Then it said my name, clearly, softly. Every nerve in my body wanted to recoil. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted iron. I remembered the second rule, never listen to them when they call. But it was too late. I had heard it. The sound of my name did something to the space around me. The walls seemed to breathe, the cinder block contracting, expanding like a diaphragm. And then I saw it, not at the end of the hall, not stepping out of a door, but pressing itself out of the very wall like wet paper peeled back by an invisible hand. It was not shaped right. The figure seemed almost human at first glance. 2 legs, arms, a head, but its proportions warped in sickening waves, as though its body was being remembered incorrectly by whoever or whatever was building it. Its limbs lengthened too far, then snapped back too short. Its face sloughed into several versions of itself before settling on something that looked eerily, horribly like my own. Not exact, not quite right. The skin too pale, the mouth too still, too patient. The eyes a shade too dark, bottomless in a way human eyes could never be. And when it spoke, it used my voice. "I knew you'd come back." The words were drawn out, savoring themselves, each syllable dripping with recognition I didn't want to admit was there. I stumbled back a step. My flashlight beam wavered over its warped body, and the light seemed to bend around it, like it wasn't subject to the same rules of material as everything else. "Don't you remember?" it whispered again. "The rules were to keep me in, and now you're here." The drone returned, louder than ever, shaking the corridor until dust fell from the ceiling tiles. My knees buckled, hands pressed against my ears, but the sound wasn't outside anymore. It was inside, rattling through my skull. When I forced my eyes open again, the figure was closer. Too close, a half-inch from touching. Its face almost pressed to mine, its breath not warm but cold, like opening a freezer door and letting the absence spill out. "Say your name," it whispered, lips stretching too wide. "Say it, and I'll let you go." I remembered the last rule, never answer back. But my own voice, repeated the words again and again in my ears, until I couldn't tell if it was the thing or myself urging me on. And then the lights went out. Chapter 13. What follows, I don't remember leaving the chamber. I don't remember the exact moment the figure in the wall ceased to move, or when the droning collapsed into silence. All I know is that I woke with my back against the cold concrete of the entryway, my flashlight trembling in my lap, its beam angled toward the dust. The recorder was still running, though it only captured the faint, static hum of failing batteries. The compound had become profoundly still, like the air after a storm. Yet beneath that stillness, there was a residue. The walls no longer droned, but when I pressed my palm against them, I swore they felt warm, almost pliant, like something had recently withdrawn deeper into them. I don't remember crossing the courtyard. I don't remember opening the main doors. The night air felt too thin, too clear. It didn't carry the compound's weight, no pressure on the chest, no endless drone in the blood. The stars looked unreal, smeared as if they'd been painted on glass, and I was standing just behind it. The gate was ahead of me, open. I could have sworn I'd left it shut when I came in. My legs moved without my consent. Gravel crunched beneath my boots, every sound stabbing the silence. My ears rang, as though the humming had burned itself so deep into me that silence could no longer exist. I touched the gate. Cold iron. I pushed it. It groaned wide, a hollow noise that seemed too loud for the open night. The road stretched out before me, empty. I walked. The compound grew smaller behind me, a black shape dissolving into the tree line. But with every step, I kept hearing it, like it was following me, or worse, like I'd carried it with me. The low drone, the rules, the voice that had whispered between the cracks of the walls. Don't leave the gate open. That was one of them, wasn't it? One of the rules they drilled into us as children. And here I was, gate swinging wide behind me. I froze. For a moment I considered going back, to close it, to obey, to keep the shape of the world intact. My body ached with the urge. It was like gravity pulling me backward, demanding I return. But I didn't. I couldn't. I kept walking. And yet, even as the road widened into the highway, even as the night air cooled the sweat on my back, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure I had ever left. Because when I glance behind me, sometimes I don't see the trees. I don't see the stars. I see the hallway, narrow, breathing, waiting. And I hear the drone, low and endless, promising me I never escaped at all. You made it back for now. But the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now too, If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video. Subscribe, but know this, some doors once opened do not close so easily.